Something isn't working. And the strange part is you already know it. Not because someone told you, because you've felt it accumulating for a while now, this quiet suspicion that the problem isn't the method. There's something closer than that. There is a mechanism that most people never actually investigate. Not because it's hidden, because it's counterintuitive to a degree that genuinely disturbs. Because it challenges directly the way you were taught to function. Most approaches to manifestation, to creation, to changing your life, they all depart from the same assumption. That you need to want intensely enough. That you need to visualize with enough detail. That you need to believe with enough conviction. That if nothing is changing, it's because you're not doing enough. That logic seems reasonable on the surface. But if you observe it carefully, you'll find something unsettling at its center. It never ends. Because enough is a ruler that can always be extended. You can always want more, visualize more, believe more, force more, and so the person stays trapped. Not for lack of effort, but because the effort itself became the prison. Daniel studied this for years. Not as concept, as personal investigation. He didn't arrive at this understanding through books, though he read them. He arrived through a specific moment when he stopped. Not by philosophical choice, by exhaustion, by having tried every way he knew and reaching a point where there was no energy left to try. It was at that point, that involuntary neutral field, that something reorganized. Not dramatically, not with immediate external signs, but internally, the structure changed. And once it changed, Daniel couldn't ignore the pattern anymore, because it was everywhere, in other people, in situations he observed, in the difference between what the tense mind produces and what the mind that stopped forcing begins to perceive. That pattern has a name in this investigation. It's called the null state. And what this script will do, slowly, carefully, is dismantle the mechanism behind it. Not so that you believe, so that you observe. First, it's necessary to understand something about how the tense mind functions. Because you already know this mind. You've probably spent a great deal of time inside it. The tense mind has a very specific structural characteristic. It is permanently oriented toward what doesn't exist yet, toward what's missing, toward what needs to be conquered, fixed, achieved. And this orientation, which seems productive, seems even virtuous, creates an effect that is rarely named with precision. It signals absence continuously. When you are constantly oriented toward what's missing, you are, in every moment, processing the world from a posture of scarcity. Not because you decided this, not because you are weak or pessimistic, but because the internal structure of trying contains, by definition, the assumption that what you desire is not yet present. Think carefully about that sentence. Trying presupposes absence. Always, structurally. It is not possible to try to obtain something you already consider present. The very grammar of trying is built on the absence of what is being tried for. So, regardless of how positive the content of the visualization is, regardless of how detailed the object of desire, the act of trying to reach it carries embedded within its structure the information that it isn't here, that there is distance, that there is effort to be made. And it is precisely that signal, not the content but the structure, that defines how you perceive and interact with the reality around you. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called selective attention. In simple terms, you perceive what you are tuned to, not because the rest doesn't exist, but because the perceptual filter you carry determines what enters your processable consciousness. This is not metaphor. It is a documented process. The nervous system receives an enormous volume of information in each moment. Most of it is filtered before reaching consciousness. What passes through the filter is determined by patterns of expectation, attention, attributed relevance. A person who wakes up convinced the day will be difficult isn't being pessimistic by choice. Their perceptual filter is literally calibrated to detect evidence of difficulty. And they will find it, not because they fabricated it, but because it's there and they are tuned to perceive it. The same applies in the opposite direction. But what is rarely investigated is what happens when the filter is no longer calibrated toward any specific direction. When there is no dominant expectation. When there is no effort oriented toward a determined outcome. That is the 0 point, the neutral field, the absence of operational identity in relation to desire. And at that point, something strange begins to occur. Sadia was 38 years old and worked as an interior architect in a city she had never imagined would be her permanent home. She had tried to change cities, careers, relationships, pace of life, with plans, with intention, with the disciplined force of someone who believes effort is virtue. Nothing had moved the way she expected. Things changed, but laterally, not frontally. Never through the path she had traced. On a Tuesday afternoon, while waiting for her coffee to cool enough to drink, she noticed she was holding the cup with both hands without looking at it. She was looking through the window without seeing anything specific. There was no active thought in that moment. No plan. No intention. There was only that. The cup, the warmth in her palms, the window, the light. She didn't know how to name what she felt. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like the absence of friction. As if a noise she had stopped perceiving as noise simply wasn't there. Nothing changed that afternoon, externally. But something in the structure of how she processed what she wanted, and what she believed was possible, began to reorganize from that moment. Not by decision, by lapse, by an instant in which the mind stopped trying to be anything. What Sadia experienced in that moment has a precise internal mechanics. It wasn't mysticism. It wasn't spiritual revelation. It was a particular state of the nervous system in which goal-oriented activity is suspended. In neurophysiology, there is a distinction between states of high activation and states of low activation of the central nervous system. In states of high activation, associated with tension, effort, intense anticipation, processing is narrow, fast, focused. It eliminates noise. It seeks the expected pattern. In states of low activation, associated with rest, contemplation, empty space, processing broadens. It becomes diffuse. It begins to capture lateral connections, patterns that were not in the narrow field of vision. This explains a phenomenon almost every person has lived. The best ideas appear in the shower. Upon waking, in the space between one task and another, never in the middle of concentrated effort. It's not coincidence. It's mechanics. When the mind stops forcing, it paradoxically expands its capacity for perception. What was outside the narrow filter of trying begins to enter. Now let's move a level deeper. Because what was described up to here, this basic mechanics of perception, is only the first layer of the mechanism. There is something deeper that happens in the null state. Something that has to do not only with what you perceive, but with who you are while you perceive it. Identity. That is the central knot. Most people carry an identity deeply intertwined with their desires, goals, and objectives. That's not a problem in itself. The problem is when identity defines itself through the effort of reaching. When being me means being someone who is trying to obtain X. When this happens, the desire for X ceases to be merely an external objective. It becomes part of the definition of the self. And here begins a paradox that silently paralyzes. If your identity is defined by the effort to achieve X, then achieving X represents, at some level, the dissolution of a part of your identity. The part that was someone in pursuit of X. This creates a deep internal resistance, not to failure but to success. A resistance that is rarely conscious, rarely verbalized, but it is operating. Observe how this appears in practice. People who spend years trying to conquer something specific, a relationship, an income level, a recognition, and when they finally get close, they sabotage. Not from incompetence, from identity disorientation, because the part of them that knew who it was tied to the search, not to the arrival. This is not weakness of character. It is identity mechanics, and it operates in everyone to some degree. The null state is not about abandoning objectives. It is about dissolving the identity that forces, about perceiving who you are independent of what you are trying to achieve, about creating an internal point that does not depend on any external result to be stable. And that point, that neutral field of identity, paradoxically, is what removes the internal resistance to what you want. Because when you don't need the result to be who you are, you stop involuntarily repelling it. Here is where most approaches make a fundamental mistake. They try to create a null state through another technique. One more exercise, one more practice, one more form of effort, and so the cycle perpetuates, because you're using tension to try to arrive at the absence of tension. It's like trying to consciously relax your shoulders. The moment you think, I'm going to relax my shoulders, you've already created a new object of effort. The shoulders relax and tense simultaneously because they are being observed with the intention of a result. The null state is not produced. It is revealed when what was covering it is removed. That distinction is critical. It is not one more thing to do. It is the perception that constant doing is what blocks access. Let's go deeper. There is a structural difference between two types of attention. Oriented attention, which is always toward something, which carries a vector, a direction, an expectation, and open attention, which simply registers what is without forcing interpretation or direction. Almost every spiritual, therapeutic, or personal development practice works with oriented attention. Focus on this. Concentrate on that. Affirm something else. Attention is always directed toward a specific content with a specific intention. The null state emerges from open attention, not directed toward anything, not expecting anything, not excluding anything. And here is the paradox that makes this difficult to explain. Open attention is not passivity. It is not inattention. It is, in fact, a state of maximum presence but without agenda, without vector, without the effort of arrival. It is the difference between looking at something trying to see what you expect to see and looking at something willing to see whatever is there. The first posture filters. The second reveals. Daniel spent a period specifically investigating what happens in the mind in the moments immediately before a significant change in someone's life. The pattern that emerged was consistent in a disconcerting way. Almost invariably, there is a point of suspension before the change. A moment in which the person stopped forcing, not by wisdom, frequently by exhaustion, and the mind stayed for a period at 0 point. It's not that exhaustion produces the change. It's that exhaustion is frequently the only mechanism the mind knows how to stop. For the mind that only knows effort, the only way to arrive at non-effort is through the exhaustion of effort. But, and here is the core of what Daniel investigated, it is possible to reach the same state without needing the exhaustion. through understanding the mechanism, through the direct perception that effort is unnecessary, not merely excessive. This is not optimism. It is engineering. It is understanding what each piece of the mechanism is for, and perceiving that some pieces you considered essential are, in fact, what is preventing the thing from functioning. There is a concept in classical physics called destructive interference. When two waves of the same frequency and amplitude meet in opposite phase, they don't add up. They cancel. The result is zero. Silence. The internal state that produces destructive interference with what you want is not negativity. It is tension. It is the effort of wanting. Because the internal field of wanting carries the frequency of absence. And when it meets the frequency of presence you are seeking, there is cancellation. This is not quantum physics applied literally to manifestation. It is a structurally precise metaphor. What is inside you when you want something intensely is not the object of desire. It is the experience of not having it. And it is that experience, that internal pattern, that defines the type of filter through which you process reality. Not because reality magically responds to your internal state, but because you literally perceive and interact with different aspects of reality depending on the internal state you inhabit. Now, a point that tends to generate resistance, and it's important to move through it. Someone might say, fine, so I just shouldn't want? Just pretend I don't care. No, that is another effort. It is trying to simulate detachment while the attachment remains intact beneath the surface. It is an additional layer of tension on top of the original tension. The null state is not performative detachment. It is not convincing yourself that it doesn't matter. It is not forced indifference. It is more subtle and more honest than that. It is the clear perception that your identity, your stability, your capacity to be present and functional does not depend on any specific external result. Not because you rehearsed this, but because you observed it directly and verified that it is true. When you perceive this truly, not as concept, but as direct observation, the desire doesn't disappear. It remains present, but it changes in nature. It ceases to be urgency. It ceases to be scarcity. It becomes preference. And preference does not interfere destructively with reality in the same way that scarcity does. There is a thought experiment that can help make this more concrete. Imagine two people who want the same job. The first believes at the deepest level of their self-perception that their life won't be okay until they get that job. That their competence, their value, their future depends on that specific result. She goes to the interview carrying that internal structure. The second genuinely wants the job. She prepared carefully, but at her deepest level, there is a stability that isn't being placed at stake in that moment. She goes to the interview present, not managing anxiety, not controlling projections, not calculating reactions. Present. Now, who performs better in the interview? Who communicates with more clarity? Who listens better to the questions? Who has more complete access to their own capabilities? The answer is not mysterious. It is mechanical. High anxiety consumes cognitive resources. It reduces response flexibility. It creates interference between intention and execution. The null state doesn't produce miracles. Produces access. Access to your own capabilities. Access to available information in the environment. Access to connections and perceptions that the tense mind automatically filters. Here enters something Daniel calls internal coherence, and that is, perhaps, the most important concept in this entire investigation. Coherence is not positivity. It's not certainty. It's not controlled expectation. Coherence is the absence of contradiction between the different layers of what you communicate, internally and externally. Between what you think you want, what your body feels, what your voice communicates, what your behavioral patterns reveal. Most people are in chronic incoherence without realizing it. They say they want one thing but feel unworthy of it. They affirm one belief but act from another. They seek an external result but carry internally the structure that contradicts it. And that incoherence is not merely inefficient. It is perceived by other people, by situations, by a nervous system that is sending mixed signals in every interaction. The null state produces coherence not because it aligns everything in a positive direction, but because it removes the layer of effort that creates contradiction. When you stop trying to be, feel, or seem something that is not organically true for you in that moment, there is a simplification. An alignment that was not fabricated because it cannot be fabricated. It can only be revealed when the noise stops. Let's talk about non-action, because this is probably the most misunderstood concept in all of this area. Non-action is not inaction. It is not passivity. It is not waiting for things to happen without participating. Non-action is the internal quality with which action occurs. It is the difference between doing something because you are reacting to the anxiety of a non-guaranteed result and doing the same thing from a stable, present internal state without urgency toward a specific result. The action may be identical in appearance. The internal quality is completely different. And that quality, that internal texture, changes what happens. Not magically, but because it changes how you perceive, how you respond, how you are present in what you are doing. A conversation conducted from anxiety and a conversation conducted from presence can have the same words. The result is rarely the same. There is an idea that circulates frequently in personal development contexts that is partially true but structurally incomplete. The universe responds to your vibration. The true part, your internal state, has measurable effect on what you perceive, how you act, and how you are perceived by others. The incomplete part. This is treated as if the universe were an entity that decides to help you or not based on your mood, which is a simplification that distorts the real mechanism. The real mechanism is more precise and, in a sense, more elegant. You are a processing system. What enters that system is determined by the filter you carry. What you process determines the connections you make, the decisions you take, the opportunities you recognize as opportunities. What you don't perceive, because it is filtered by the structure of tension, can be abundant and completely invisible to you at the same time. When the filter changes, when the internal state changes, what enters the system changes. And therefore what is processed, decided, communicated, and acted upon changes. Not because reality reorganized itself for you, but because you reorganized in relation to reality. That is less romantic than the universe conspires in your favor. But it is more useful, because it is observable, verifiable. It doesn't require belief, it requires investigation. Now Daniel wants to introduce something he calls the illusion of preparation. Many people are perpetually preparing for the life they want, accumulating conditions, qualifications, resources, experiences, all of it as preparation for when it's finally the right moment, for when they are ready. This pattern has a logic that seems reasonable. It makes sense to prepare before acting. The problem is when preparation becomes structural, when it is not a phase but an identity, when being someone who is preparing is the way of avoiding direct contact with the reality of what is being sought. Because preparation, in its internal structure, is identical to trying, contains the same presupposition of absence. I'm not ready yet is the same structure as I don't have what I want yet. The null state dissolves the illusion of preparation, not because it suggests you act without preparation, but because the 0 point of identity has no ready and not ready. It only has what is now. And what is now is always sufficient starting point for the next real step, not for the complete plan, but for the next step. That is an important distinction. The tense mind plans completely before acting. The mind at 0 point acts on the next available step and reads what reveals itself. It is more sensitive to reality because it is not trapped in the map it created of it. There is a form of rigidity that most people don't identify as rigidity because it presents itself as commitment, as focus, as clarity of objective. It is rigidity in relation to the form through which the result should arrive. You want X. You have clarity about X. But you also have clarity, frequently not conscious, about how X should appear. Through which path? In which sequence? With which specific characteristics? And when reality begins to move something toward the essence of what you want, but through a path that was not in your map, you don't recognize it as part of the response. Or you discard it because it doesn't correspond to the expected format. This is not a failure of perception. It is the direct effect of a very rigid map. And a rigid map is always a product of tension, of effort oriented toward a specific result with a specific form. The null state does not dissolve the objective. It dissolves the rigidity in relation to the form, and that, paradoxically, broadens the field of real possibilities that you can perceive as relevant. There is a particular moment in internal investigation that Daniel describes as the reversal point. It is not a moment of insight. It is not an emotional epiphany. It is quieter than that. It is the moment in which you perceive, not intellectually but functionally, that the tension you were calling wanting intensely was, in practice, creating the constant experience of not having. That the effort to manifest was manifesting, with considerable precision, the experience of being in the effort of manifesting. When this is seen with sufficient clarity, it can no longer not be seen. It's like those optical illusion images in which there are two overlapping patterns. You see one or you see the other, but rarely both at the same time. And when you finally see the second, you can no longer see only the first without perceiving that the second is there. Constant effort at creation produces the constant experience of having not yet created. That is the second pattern. And once seen, it fundamentally changes the relationship with effort. Something needs to be said about trust. There is a form of trust that people seek in spiritual practice, in personal development, in internal investigation, that is essentially a form of anticipated certainty. Trust that it will work out. Trust that the universe is working in your favor. That has the appeal of being comforting. But structurally, it is still tension. It is still a posture in relation to a future result. The trust that emerges from the null state is different. It is not trust in a result. It is trust in the process of perception. It is the willingness to see what is really happening without the filter of urgency, and respond to what is real instead of to what is projected. This is more stable than trusting that things will work out, because it does not depend on how things go. It depends on how you are present in the process. And paradoxically, this form of stability, which is not hope, not optimism, not certainty, is what allows you to act with more real effectiveness on what can actually be altered. Because you are seeing what is there, not what you fear is there, not what you wish were there. What is? Let's talk about an aspect that is rarely addressed: the role of the sufferer identity. When a person goes through a long period of difficulty, of not getting what they want, of trying without result, of feeling something is blocked, That period begins to shape the identity in a particular way. The experience of difficulty becomes familiar, recognizable, at some level comfortable, not because it's pleasant, but because it's known. And there is something in human psychology that tends to reproduce the familiar, not from masochism, from identity coherence, because you know how to be someone who is going through difficulty. You have the patterns of thought. You have the narratives. You have the ways of explaining to yourself what is happening. When the null state begins to be accessed, when chronic tension begins to dissolve, this can generate, paradoxically, a form of disorientation. Not immediate relief, because who am I if I'm not someone who is struggling? This is not theoretical. Daniel observed this repeatedly. The dissolution of the effort identity is not always experienced as immediate liberation. Sometimes it is experienced as loss, as a type of emptiness that needs to be traversed before something more stable can emerge. Knowing this in advance is useful, because when you feel that emptiness, when the tension begins to dissolve and you don't quite know who you are without it, you can recognize this as part of the process, not as evidence that something went wrong. There is a particular quality of attention that happens in the null state that Daniel calls non-reference presence. What does that mean? Normally, presence is referenced. You are present in relation to something, in relation to an objective, in relation to a concern, in relation to an expectation. There is always a reference point that organizes the experience of the present moment. In the null state, presence exists without dominant reference. It is not the absence of perception. It is maximum perception without an organizing agenda, like being completely awake, but not awake for anything specific. This is difficult to describe in language because language is structurally referenced. Every sentence is about something. Every word points to a referent. But the experience of non-reference presence is precisely what happens in the intervals between thoughts when they are long enough to be noticed. Most people have fragments of this experience in daily life. The problem is that they are so brief, and the mind so quickly fills them with the next thought, the next plan, the next concern, that there is rarely time to notice what was there in the interval. The null state is not a technique for prolonging those intervals. It is an investigation into what is present in the interval, and into what could be different if the proportion between content and interval changed. Now, a point about reality and perception that is important not to mystify. Reality exists independently of how you perceive it. The job is there or it isn't. The person exists or they don't. The money is available or it isn't. The null state doesn't change objective reality. What it changes is the field of reality that you can perceive, access, and interact with. And that, in concrete human practice, makes considerable difference. Because the field of accessible reality for most people is significantly smaller than the field of available reality. Tension reduces the field. The null state expands it. An opportunity that you don't perceive as an opportunity, because it is filtered by the rigid map of what the result should look like, is not accessible to you even if it is physically present. A connection you don't make because you are processing with the narrow filter of urgency does not influence your next step, even though the information was available. It's not magic. It is perceptual mechanics. And the practical implication is direct. Expanding the perceptual field through the null state is not abstract spiritual exercise. It is what allows you to operate in contact with actual reality, rather than with the reduced model that tension produced. There is a critique that naturally arises here, and it is honest to address it directly. Daniel, you're basically saying to give up, to not try, to stay passive waiting for things to happen. No. But the confusion is understandable, and the distinction matters. Giving up, in the colloquial sense, is a posture of defeat. It contains within it the recognition that I tried and failed, that the result is impossible or undesirable, that the effort is no longer worth it. Giving up is still reference to the objective, still carries the structure of relation to the result, only now the relation is renunciation instead of pursuit. The null state is not giving up. It is prior to trying and to giving up. It is the perception that there is a third state, not trying, not giving up, which is simply being present in what is, without the overlay of an effort oriented toward what should be. And from that state, which is not passive, it is intensely present, action is possible. But it is a different action. It is an action that is not in conflict with the present while seeking the future. It is an action that emerges from the clear perception of what is real now, instead of from anxiety about what could or could not be. This is not semantics. The quality of action changes completely depending on the internal state from which it emerges. And the results, over time, consistently do too. There is something about time that deserves attention here. The tense mind is always in relation to the future. Even when it thinks it's in the present, it's using the present as a launching platform for the future, as a position from which to observe whether the future is developing as expected, as a point of anxiety about what hasn't happened yet. The null state collapses that relationship with the future, not to never plan again, but to make the present the only real location of operation. And this has a direct consequence that is rarely named. When the present is the real location of operation, the quality of attention you bring to each specific action changes. Because you are not divided between doing this and thinking about that. You are whole in what you are doing. And actions done with whole attention have, consistently, different quality than actions done by a mind divided between the present and the anxious future. This is not just productivity. It is the difference between living inside the experience and living beside it, managing it as it happens. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than through tension. This is not something that is decided. It is something that is investigated. For those who feel it makes sense to continue, not out of obligation, but because something in this direction has genuine resonance, the deepening material is available in the pinned comment. It is a continuation of this investigation. For those at the point of wanting to go deeper into the mechanism, not just understand the surface. Now the closing. And the closing is not going to be a synthesis, because syntheses are products of the mind that organizes, and what was explored here is not meant to be organized back into a clean list. It is meant to be felt in its complexity and contradiction until something reorganizes on its own. But there is one thing Daniel wants to leave with clarity. What you are seeking is not on the other side of more effort. It is on the other side of a different kind of relationship with effort. Not the absence of action, the different quality of where action emerges from. And that quality, that internal state from which it is possible to perceive more, act with more coherence, be present without the interference of urgency, is not an advanced level you will reach when you have worked sufficiently. It is accessible now, in the next interval, in the next moment when the mind pauses between one thought and the following. The question is not whether you can get there. The question is whether you are willing to notice that you have already been there, and that what you called insufficiency in that moment was, in fact, the only state from which real change organizes itself. You never achieved anything while you were clenching your teeth trying. You achieved it when, For some reason, the clenching stopped. Now that you see the mechanism, the question is what you do with it. If this touched something real for you, a recognition, a perception, a word that summarized what you were feeling, write it in the comments. Your name, and one word. Silence, neutrality, coherence, surrender, whatever is true for you right now.